In my years as a priest, I have been able to participate in some truly extraordinary and uplifting liturgies. One of the most memorable was the Mass icon celebrated years ago in the African country of Uganda. I had always heard how vibrant the African liturgies are, but this was beyond all expectation. With my companion, Father Philip, I arrived at the village church at the time we thought the Mass was to begin. But the church was empty, except for a few chickens running around the inside of the church praying. As in every African village, hundreds of little children were playing outside. But the local priest was nowhere to be found. When we asked the sacristan when the priest would arrive, we were told it was impossible to tell, because the poor man had 22 churches to take care of. I asked how the people would know when to come to church. He smiled and said, "You will see." Finally, we heard the sound of the priest's motorcycle ascending the steep hill. I was sure they would then ring the church bells to summon the people. But there was no bell, no steeple. Instead, hanging in the trees was a beautiful set of African drums. The elders approached them and with all their might beat those drums to call the people to Mass. For miles around, the sound of the drums could be heard echoing through the lush green hills. Immediately, a procession of people began to wind up the hill. Hard-working farmers, old men in long white robes with walking sticks taller than they, women carrying baskets on their heads and babies on their backs, countless children running eagerly toward the church. It was a sight I will never forget. They were being called by the sound of the drums, called to the house of God. As the people gathered in church, the colorfully robed choir led the singing in magnificent and natural African harmony. But there was no organ, no piano, no expensive sound system. All they had was a set of African drums to accompany their powerful singing. Heaven must sound something like that. Then the priests processed in, preceded by a group of young dancers. All danced their way into the church to the beat of drums and the joyful harmonies of human voice. This was the Mass for the blessing of the harvest. One by one, the people brought their crops to the altar. 8-foot bundles of sugar cane carried on their shoulders, huge woven baskets filled with grain, beans or peas, enormous watermelons, pumpkins, ears of corn. After each item was blessed, it was placed around the altar. Those whose crops were not yet ready, or perhaps already finished, brought their hands to be blessed, the hands that had worked so hard to sow and to harvest. When all the crops were in place around the altar and dedicated to God, the drums began to beat furiously, and the entire congregation broke out spontaneously into a jubilant song and dance of thanksgiving. They had been blessed with a successful harvest. Their families could eat, and their heartfelt gratitude quite literally shook their entire being. Priests and people together expressing their jubilation with voice and limb. At the end of Mass, the crops that had been blessed were distributed to the members of the congregation according to their need. Philip and I both agreed that this was the most heartfelt, the most dynamic, the most inspirational liturgy we had ever experienced. The drums of Africa will haunt my heart my whole life long. I will hear those drums summoning me up the mountain, calling me to God. Perhaps you will hear God's drums in the form of the bells of your own house of worship, perhaps in the form of a cry for help from someone in need. Perhaps you will hear the drums in that little voice inside of each one of us calling us to higher things. Each of us can hear those drums of God if we allow our ears to be opened. Ephata, calls the Lord, be opened. The ears of the deaf man were opened, and he could hear God's drums calling him to something far beyond what he had ever known. Let us listen for those drums. They will come to us in different ways, but they will come. And they will call us to climb that mountain, to ascend to something higher. Just as the people in that African village did not leave their earthly things behind, did not abandon the work of their hands, did not disdain what they were doing in their everyday life, but rather placed it into God's hands to be consecrated and made holy, so we too are called to do the same. That is liturgy. That is prayer. That is responding to the drums of God. Throughout our life, we will be summoned by the drums reverberating through the hills and through our hearts, summoned to care more, summoned to love more, summoned to be more, until finally one day we will hear those drums one last time, calling us to ascend a higher mountain. May our ears be opened that we may live and walk and dance to the eternal, powerful rhythm of the awesome drums